Vamos para comenzar, me llamo Mar y os voy a pedir que que quitéis el micrófono por un momento.
Peraí, Luiz, que tá...
Mar, can I suggest that you ask everyone to mute?
Yeah, I just did and it was supposed to happen automatically. I'm sorry. Si podéis quitar el micrófono para poder, si os podéis poner en mute.
Se puede silenciar, Mar.
Silenciar, gracias, Javier.
Pero lo puedes hacer tú, ¿eh? El host lo hace.
Sí, lo estoy
Vale.
intentando.
Hola. Ay, yo creo que ya está.
Ok, pues bienvenidos.
Hola, buenas.
Os voy a pedir que os quitéis el micrófono por un momento y luego cuando sea el momento de preguntas lo volvemos a poner, pero si os podéis silenciar para empezar. Somos 111 participantes y va a haber dos canales solo voy a dar un minuto de explicación técnica de Zoom. Va a haber dos canales de traducción simultánea, uno al español y otro al portugués, y deberíais poder ver en vuestra pantalla, en la parte de abajo a la derecha, como un globo terráqueo que dice Interpretation. Entonces ahí podéis elegir inglés o portugués. Perdón, español o portugués. Ok, entonces vamos la charla de hoy va a empezar con una introducción de Javier Garcia Campayo y luego va a haber una charla con Joe Loizzo de unos 30 minutos y luego va a haber tiempo de preguntas y respuestas al final. Si alguien tiene un problema con interpretación o idioma que no oye por el canal adecuado, me puede enviar un chat y yo le ayudo con cualquier problema técnico. ¿Ok? Pues estamos listos, Javier.
Muy bien, pues buenas tardes en España, buenos días según la hora, ¿no? En algunos países de Latinoamérica. Me llamo Javier Garcia Campayo, soy director del Máster de Mindfulness de la Universidad de Zaragoza y también director de los programas en español del Instituto Nalanda de Nueva York. Esta es una actividad gratuita del Instituto Nalanda dirigida al público general y cuyo objetivo sería expandir el conocimiento de la psicología y la psicoterapia contemplativa. El Instituto Nalanda, cuyo nombre recuerda a la famosa universidad monástica budista medieval, es una institución formativa que no está ligada a una universidad para tener mayor libertad en sus contenidos formativos y que surgió hace más de 20 años en Nueva York de la mano principalmente de Joe Loizzo, quien hablará posteriormente, y de algunos otros formadores. Su objetivo, como decía, es la difusión de la psicoterapia y la ciencia contemplativa. Joe nos hablará más de este tema, pero básicamente sería la aplicación de la sabiduría transmitida por las tradiciones contemplativas de la humanidad para ser utilizada como terapia y también para el desarrollo del ser humano. Es decir, que serviría para el tratamiento de enfermedades físicas y psicológicas, pero también, y en mi opinión, sobre todo, para conseguir mayores niveles de bienestar, de paz y de sentido en las personas que lo practican. Por eso, los alumnos de Nalanda proceden del mundo de la salud, pero también del entorno de la educación, del trabajo, del deporte y de cualquier ámbito que sea susceptible de mejorar con las ciencias contemplativas. La formación de Nalanda está estructurada en 2 años, un año de mindfulness, que es el que empezamos ahora, y otro año, otro curso de compasión que se iniciará el curso que viene. En ello se trabajan los diferentes tipos de meditaciones atencionales, generativas, con especial énfasis en la compasión, y también deconstructivas. Se abordan formatos individuales y grupales, se analizan múltiples técnicas meditativas y su aplicación. y todo esto se liga con los conocimientos científicos actuales y sobre todo con la neurobiología, con la neurociencia. Algunos de los profesores de Nalanda, que para mi gusto es un staff realmente impresionante, incluyen personas como Tara Brach, Richard Davidson, Mark Epstein, John Halifax, Ray Hudson, Richard Vermeer, Shannon Salzberg. La formación se realiza mediante 2 retiros intensivos al inicio y al final del curso y mediante charlas quincenales donde se analizan y profundizan diferentes temas con abundantes preguntas y respuestas. Y al final se realiza cada año un trabajo final de curso o capstone en el que se aplica de forma práctica las enseñanzas al entorno que desea el estudiante, a donde más le interesa. Junto a ello, hay sesiones abiertas como esta que celebramos hoy, donde vamos a tratar algunos de los fundamentos de la psicología budista. Dejo pues paso al profesor Joe Loizzo y agradezco vuestra asistencia y espero que disfrutéis. Nos vemos luego también en la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Joe, cuando quiera.
Okay. Muchas gracias, Javier. Thank you so much for that generous introduction and for sharing a little bit of the history of Nalanda University, which is our inspiration as an institute, and of Nalanda Institute in New York City, which has programs in Canada, in different parts of the US, and obviously in Spain and Latin America with your help and with the help of Mar Age, our program director. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about, and I also want to thank our translators, Doris and Fausto, and Fernanda and Aula for their work that they put into our students from our Compassion Year, for the work they put in spreading the word in Brazil. And I'm very happy to be here to share with you something that's really been my life's work, which is the growing confluence or convergence of Western psychotherapy, modern psychology and psychotherapy with ancient contemplative traditions of self-healing and contemplative healing.
Joe, I'm sorry. There's some people are saying that they cannot hear you and some people can hear you. Los que necesitéis traducción de Joe al español, podéis elegir el canal Spanish o español. En la parte baja de vuestra pantalla hay un globo terráqueo que se llama interpretación o traducción, interpretation, y ahí podéis elegir el idioma portugués o español.
Yeah, and Mar, there's, for some reason, I'm not showing up. I'm not showing up as the speaker when I speak, so I don't know what that's about.
Okay, let me put the speaker view. I can see you as the speaker.
Okay, okay.
Eu estou vendo você.
Okay, so should I continue?
Yes, please.
Então, posso continuar?
Okay. So basically, we have a very big topic today. And that's contemplative psychotherapy, which is really something new. It's a new global fusion between very different traditions. So I'll try to explain to you, I'm going to start from where we are. How did we get here? How did we get to having this meeting today? How is it that contemplation, that is meditation, yoga, prayer, reflection, is coming together with psychotherapy in a very powerful way? So, of course, most of you have heard of Herbert Benson, for example, or certainly John Kabat-Zinn. These are researchers that I worked with as a young student in medical school, and they really began the process of trying to understand the healing benefits of meditation, and to look at how simple practices of meditation could help improve physical health, improve mental health, help people cope with all kinds of suffering like chronic pain and anxiety, both mental suffering and physical suffering. So not long after Jon Kabat-Zinn developed mindfulness-based stress reduction in the 80s, the 1980s, colleagues of his who were psychiatrists and psychologists began to apply his work to anxiety and other common mental afflictions, and found that there was some real efficacy. And that began a process of integrating mindfulness as a discipline, that is, mindfulness as the practice of training attention, into Western psychotherapies, most commonly into cognitive behavioral approaches. Right? So we have mindfulness-based cognitive therapy that grew out of that first research on MBSR. We have ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. Eventually, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. These are all different forms of integrating mindfulness practice as a general practice of training attention and awareness with Western psychotherapy. But as people began to, go deeper in terms of understanding the sources of mindfulness and really being more interested in what was the original psychology behind mindfulness and what other practices were involved in that might be healing and beneficial, we really started to discover in the late 90s and early 2000s that mindfulness itself, or what we think of as mindfulness, that Jon describes it as paying attention without judgment or bias in the here and now, that really is just a very simple beginning form of mindfulness practice. And in a sense, in my view, it really only accounts for a few percent of the full healing impact of the contemplative tradition it came from, right? So if we look at the Nalanda tradition, which is, I'll explain to you, is a tradition that evolved, as Javier mentioned, starting in the 2nd century and moving up until the 12th century. In that tradition, there are many different forms of contemplative psychology and contemplative practice. And I would say that the work that Jon integrated into psychotherapy really is just like dipping the toe in the ocean. There's so much more. And so we've been increasingly discovering what that more is. So for instance, in addition to focusing mindfulness on the breath to calm attention and train attention, we can focus mindfulness on other things. Our sensitivity, that is, our feelings of pain and pleasure. We can focus mindfulness on awareness itself, and try to expand the clarity and the capacity of awareness to stretch and learn. We can focus mindfulness on everything that's happening within and around us in order to cultivate greater wisdom and compassion. And that's a practice we know as insight meditation, right? That is really the endpoint of mindfulness training in Buddhist psychology, is not to just be mindful. If we were just very mindful of how miserable we are, that's not going to be all that much help. I mean, it may be better than just reacting to make things worse, but we really want to just be able to not only face what's happening in our lives, but to be able to have the strength of mind and the skills to try to heal. And that's the whole framework that the Buddha taught. Some of the readings that Javier shared with you explain that basic framework, the Four Noble Truths framework, which basically are the Buddha's model of healing. How do we heal the human condition? Part of that model includes the practices of mindfulness that train our mind to be able to understand our own suffering and heal ourselves. So we really began in the 90s to learn that there was so much more to Buddhist psychology, and we began to develop new approaches that not only integrated the practice of mindfulness, but also integrated the other major disciplines that are part of the Buddhist healing path, and that includes developing our ethics. There's Mar. I think you need to mute yourself, Mar. Developing the ethics that is our positive motivation and our positive action in the world, as well as wisdom, really learning how to understand our suffering and how to work with it skillfully. So in the Buddhist teaching, mindfulness per se is only one of three basic disciplines. And without the other two disciplines of wisdom and ethics, they say mindfulness really is like a bird without wings. It won't fly. And you can think of those of you who are clinicians and know about Western cognitive behavioral therapy. We began to integrate, as I said, mindfulness into cognitive behavioral therapy. And in a way, changing the way we think, the cognitive part of cognitive therapy really relates to the wisdom discipline that the Buddha taught. And behavioral interventions, that is changing the way we interact in the world or behave every day, relates to the ethics discipline. So in a way, what we learned when we started to study the source of mindfulness is that we didn't need Western cognitive behavioral therapy. If we wanted to really have the full benefit of the mindfulness healing practice or mindfulness-based therapy, we could integrate the practices of insight and the practices of ethical action from the Buddhist tradition. So that's one whole new horizon that opened up in the 90s. Subsequently, we began to discover that especially in terms of our ethics, but even in terms of our self-healing, that mindfulness wasn't enough, in a way that mindfulness, training our attention wasn't enough to really bring healing. That we needed also to train our emotions and to learn how to develop more, kinder, more caring, more nurturing emotional life in order to really be able to live with ourselves better, to understand ourselves better, and to heal better. So practices like self-compassion, developed by Chris Germer and Kristen Neff, became very well known, or loving kindness practice brought into awareness by Sharon Salzberg especially became extremely important. And soon in the early 2000s, we started to see even more advanced practices for training compassion, not just for oneself, but training compassion for others. So practices like CBCT, cognitively based compassion therapy, which was developed by Geshe Negi at Emory University, or CCT, compassion cultivation training developed by the Dalai Lama's translator, Thupten Jinpa at Stanford. and also CBRT, which is an intervention that I developed at New York Hospital. That's the Columbia University Hospital System. Compassion-based resilience training is the name of that intervention. These are all practices that are building on another whole wave, as I call it, of contemplative psychology, right? These are not just tools to train attention, they're tools to regulate and shift our emotion or develop our emotions. So already there we began to realize that the word mindfulness-based therapy wasn't a big enough word. We needed to really integrate, have a sort of container or an understanding of this new confluence of contemplative practices with psychotherapy that was big enough to contain all the different practices that people were finding useful from the Indic tradition, from the Nalanda tradition. And that obviously also included the second, what I call the second wave, compassion. So this is where we began to introduce the word contemplative psychotherapy, right? Rather than mindfulness-based psychotherapy or compassion-focused therapy that was a practice developed by Paul Gilbert. We really, I believe, need a very big container, and contemplative provides that container because it essentially says any kind of training of a reflective awareness, self-awareness, self-regulation that relies on meditative practices or yoga practices or any kind of spiritual exercises of self-development really can be beneficial in psychotherapy. And I'll explain to you, I talk about 3 different waves, and part of the reason I talk about 3 waves of contemplative psychotherapy is because the Nalanda tradition, which developed, as I said, around the 2nd to the 5th century in India, inherited already almost 1,000 years of the evolution of Buddhist psychology and Buddhist healing practices. So starting in the Buddha's day, the first tradition that we became familiar with, that the first older tradition, the Pali tradition based in Burma, really focused on mindfulness. But then starting around the time of the Common Era, the Christian era, this practice of compassion became much more important. And that is the sort of basis of the second major form of Buddhist psychology, which we find in East Asia, in Japan, China, Indochina, Korea, and so on. And that's called the Mahayana, or the universal vehicle, or it's the vehicle of social healing. And then finally, there developed even yet another wave of contemplative practice that involves not just the mind and not just the heart, but also is addressed to healing the body, to healing the nervous system, to helping deal with the unconscious traumas that lodge inside our deepest early visceral experience. And those are practices I call embodied practices. So essentially, as we look at the way in which we have become increasingly aware of this whole ocean of practices from the Indic tradition, from the Nalanda tradition, we see 3 waves of confluence. The first is coming together with mindfulness and understanding how do we train our attention so we can heal ourselves better. The second, and that really began in the 80s and really kept growing exponentially until the 90s and early 2000s. Meanwhile, in the late 90s and early 2000s, we developed this research on this whole second aspect of contemplative practice, compassion. And that is what I call the second wave. And right now we're sort of in the middle of that, right? Where we are, you'll find the there's a lot of excitement about self-compassion and a lot of excitement about compassion training, using compassion to increase empathy, using compassion for social justice or creating greater social healing, healing racial or class or gender inequity. And what I'm going to share with you is that there's even a third wave that sort of hasn't quite come yet. And that has to do with embodied practices that are there to really help us heal trauma. That's the deepest unconscious impact of stress on our nervous system. And those practices include things like visualization, mantra or affirmation or prayer, deep breath work as in Kundalini or the Tibetan exercises called Tumo, and body work, moving the body, massaging the body, calming the body, as in Tai Chi, as in yoga, and all of those things. So the contemplative psychotherapy includes all of these different practices, right? So that's just a basic introduction. And as Javier mentioned in his comments, that in our contemplative psychotherapy program, we spend 1 year with the foundation teaching how mindfulness and the psychology of mindfulness, basic Buddhist psychology, including the understanding of the nature of the self, the nature of mind, suffering and healing. And the second year we focus on compassion. And that includes learning how to develop compassion for oneself, learning how to extend compassion to all other living beings a little bit at a time, stretching those muscles as we learn in positive psychology, which are really powerful healing agents or medicines, and can be socially healing too. And then at the end of the second year, we learn embodied practices. That is, we learn how to use imagery to transform our self-concept or our vision of the world. We learn how to use intensive breath work to change our energy and shift out of stress energy into bliss energy. And then we use embodied awareness, deep non-dual awareness practice. Some people call this Mahamudra or Dzogchen or non-dual meditation. We use that to really free our minds on the subtlest level from stress and alienation. So in the 2 years, we cover all of those things. But the first thing I just want to take a step back and ask, why is this, so revolutionary? And it is. When I was in training, my father was a psychiatrist, and in his era, and when I was in training, psychiatry and psychology were very much medicalized, and they were not really very open to spirituality and religion. In fact, they were very skeptical of meditation, spirituality, and religion. And that's not an accident. That's a result of Freud's effort when he founded psychotherapy to split it apart from or differentiate it from religion, contemplation, yoga, meditation, and spirituality. He really made a great effort to take psychology away from the spiritual traditions, which had historically been humanity's ways of healing the mind for most of history. And when he did that, the good news was that he was able to take psychotherapy and bring it into modern scientific medicine. And as a result, it's a very common institution now, and it's very accepted in medicine. Unfortunately, he also tore it away from the contemplative traditions, the wisdom traditions of humanity that have traditionally been our source of psychic healing. And also, especially, we're focused on our unleashing our full potential for healing and transformation, what we now call positive psychology. So in a sense, what's happened over the last 20 years or 25 years is that that division, that split that Freud created has been bridged. And now we have the coming together of psychotherapy as an institution with contemplative healing. Now, some people may say, you know, how does that happen? How do we take an ancient meditation tradition that's supposed to be spiritual and connect it with a medical tradition that's supposed to be just for mental health, for just treating diseases? And so what I want to just share with you is that I believe that there are some very fundamental similarities between Western psychotherapy, modern Western psychotherapy, and Buddhist psychology that help us understand why it is that Buddhism and Buddhist psychology and practice has been so actively integrated by Western neuroscientists, mental health professionals, and so on. So what are the commonalities? I believe that there are three key commonalities. One is that both Buddha and Freud believed that the mind operated based on causality, that it was part of nature, and that when the mind acted, it had specific causal effects, that it was a real causal natural phenomenon. And that led to an understanding that what our minds do matters. And that's something that is not really particularly true of the general view of the mind in the modern scientific world. In the modern scientific world, in a way, we're taught we don't really have a mind. We just have a brain, and the brain does things, but it doesn't really matter what the brain does. What matters is our genes or our chemistry. But in these ancient traditions and in psychotherapy, there's an understanding that how the mind acts is very, very powerful in determining our health and well-being. And it turns out that research is supporting that. The research on meditation is showing that our state of mind powerfully impacts our brain and can reshape our brain, the plastic nature of our neurons, so that we start becoming healthier and more integrated as people. And meditation became extremely important. In a way, the mindfulness revolution began when people linked together the discovery of neuroplasticity, that the brain is plastic, with the discovery that meditation is one of the most powerful ways to increase and direct the plasticity of the mind. That studies done in the early 2000s showed that meditators can really control the plasticity of their brain in ways that ordinary people can't. And this is why we have a mindfulness revolution, and mindfulness has been taken up in British healthcare system, in much of the US, and in many places in the world, because by training attention, mindfulness allows us to control the way our brains operate. You know, this is something that makes sense from the standpoint of both Buddhist psychology and modern Western psychology. Another key aspect of commonality is that both the Buddhist psychology and modern Western psychology see human life as evolutionary. That is, they see life as part of a natural process of gradual change over generations, over infinite lifetimes, and that we can evolve and that we develop based on nature. And of course, the second piece of it is we come into the world with a nature, right? We inherit through our genome a tremendous amount of learning from survival through eons, but that our nature as humans is activated by the nurture, by the way we engage with our caregivers. So attachment theory and developmental psychology have shown us that the power of the interaction between caregivers and infants and children shapes the basis of our emotional life and really the basis of our psychology for the rest of our lives to some extent. And in that way, both Buddhist psychology and Western psychology, modern psychotherapy, agree that who we are as a product of the complicated interplay of evolutionary nature, the way we're wired by evolution, and nurture, the way we develop in interaction with others. The third commonality is the understanding that the best way to transform a human nervous system is by reparenting it, right? In other words, since our nervous systems evolve, when our brains engage with the minds and brains of our parents and nature interacts with nurture, if we're going to change the way we developed as young people, then the best way to do that is to do that within the context of having a relationship that is a caring, parenting, guiding relationship. So all Buddhist teaching is founded on this teacher-student relationship in the same way that psychotherapy is founded on the relationship between the therapist and the client. So those are three key things, so we can maybe begin to understand that Buddhism has already some unique elements that make it different from other religious traditions to some extent, that allow it to bridge much more easily with Western psychology and the modern psychological or neuropsychological understanding of human nature. And that may be a reason why Buddhism is kind of like a bridge in a very centuries-old divide between spiritual traditions and modern science, right? Because Buddhism is a kind of, some people say, a scientific religion. It has a worldview and assumptions about life and an approach, a healing approach to life that is very similar to modern neuropsychology or psychotherapy. Well, of course, they're not the same, though. And of course, I like to point out we need to respect several key differences. You know, on one level, the differences are simply that, you know, of course, completely different cultures and time periods and assumptions in some ways. But more specifically, the Buddhist view of evolution is multi-life oriented and is more Lamarckian. That is to say, in the Buddhist view, the mind is much more important in determining our future than in modern science or even modern psychotherapy. So in the way, Buddhism is a little more optimistic, which is one of the reasons why it's being so welcomed into mental health. The other difference is that Buddhism is fundamentally based in spiritual institutions and practices, whereas psychotherapy is based in scientific medicine. So, for example, the tendency in psychotherapy to diagnose and treat illness is much less so than in Buddhist psychology, where there are diagnoses and there are treatments, but overall, Buddhism is seen as a therapy for the human condition, for everybody, as something that every human being needs to live well and happily. And the emphasis on specific kind of disorders is much less significant than the overall public health impact that we all need to learn how to live better with our minds and brains and with each other. And then a final difference obviously comes from that, which is methodologically, Buddhist Western psychology is very individual centered, whereas Buddhist healing is very communally, or it's both communal group learning and individual learning integrated in a very powerful soup or mix. So those are some of the key differences we have to respect. These are not the same. Buddhist psychology is not the same as modern psychotherapy, but I call them sisters under the skin. They're very similar healing traditions with a lot of similar assumptions. And if we understand that Buddhism emphasizes the positive health and public health and the power of the mind to transform our way of being a little bit more than psychotherapy, and hence is a little bit more optimistic and has, I think, some more public health impact. So I'm just going to make a few final points and then open it up for conversation. So some of the final points about this is just to sort of step back and say, first of all, one thing, I don't think contemplative psychotherapy is unique to Buddhism. I really believe, and we at Nalanda believe, that all contemplative traditions can be healing. And in a way, the bridge between Buddhist psychology, modern neuroscience, and psychotherapy is a bridge that allows all contemplative traditions to potentially connect more and be more involved in psychotherapy. So I'm hoping that that will happen. The second major point is that it isn't all an accident. In other words, this isn't simply accidental that two traditions sort of at the opposite ends of history and opposite sides of the planet came up with something very similar in terms of their understanding of human nature and healing. It's a reflection of the way our nature is. And so the research, for example, shows that the practices I've mentioned, mindfulness, compassion, and embodied practices, really do actually impact different parts of our brain, right? So mindfulness is much more active in the newer part of our brain, the neocortex, that we share with other primates, where we do reasoning and imagining. Compassion really works in the limbic part of our brain, the early mammalian part of our brain that we developed to nurture our young and connect with others closely. And embodied practices work especially well in healing and transforming the oldest part of our brain, the brainstem or the vertebrate brain. And so I believe that there's a biology that explains that we need many different approaches to transforming the mind and the brain, and that there are probably many different contemplative practices around the world that can help suffering and stress and trauma as they impact different parts of our nervous system and different layers of our mind. I also believe there's a kind of overlap. So I will say that the psychology of mindfulness is especially good for training attention to deal with anxiety and behavioral problems. The compassion practices that are taught in the Mahayana are especially good for dealing with relationships and social suffering. And the embodied practices are especially good for dealing with trauma and more visceral sort of levels of stress. And it's not a surprise that there are many different schools of psychotherapy as well, right? So we have traditional cognitive or psychodynamic therapy, which I believe operates mostly at the level of the neocortex. We have relational or intersubjective or family systems approaches that operate really working with our limbic system or our emotional brain. And we have embodied approaches like somatic experiencing, internal family systems, Jungian, Reichian, Gestalt, and all of these that work more with the oldest part of our brain and hence work a little better with trauma. So in this sense, I'm trying to share with you this big map of contemplative psychotherapy, the understanding of how these ancient spiritual traditions have been coming together with neuroscience and with modern psychotherapy to really maybe bring the best of both worlds, to bring a lot of practices and wisdom that we in the West threw out centuries ago, and to enrich our way of understanding suffering and healing suffering, especially in the realm of psychotherapy. So I guess with that, I will just open it up for discussion. I think, again, as Javier mentioned, how all of these different psychologies and different methods of practice, of meditative practice, are taught in our contemplative psychotherapy program, but I'm happy to either address general questions or specific questions about the program. So, Mar, do you want to encourage people to unmute themselves if they have a question, or are you going to ask them to do chat?
Yeah, the translators prefer chat, but if someone prefers to have a live interaction, I can give them two options maybe. Podéis hacer preguntas por el chat, que entonces leeremos a los profesores. O si alguien prefiere tener una interacción directa con los profesores, le puedo quitar. Ahora estáis mudos para que no hubiera problemas de sonido, pero podéis levantar una mano virtual o real y os puedo dar voz desde aquí. Ok, hay una pregunta en el chat. Could you repeat the information about different kinds of practices and problems addressed? You mentioned at the final part.
Yes. Okay. So yeah, I think that I want to say overall, our philosophy at Nalanda is that all meditative practices can heal many different problems. We're not as disease-oriented as modern psychotherapy or Western psychology, but there are also, there are overlaps, or there's special impacts that different practices have. So I believe that simple practices like anxiety, problems like anxiety disorders, or obsessions, addictions, compulsions. These are well dealt with using mindfulness, because essentially we're really interrupting a set of compulsive habit patterns. Training attention is a way of slowing the system down and bringing more awareness into patterns that would normally be compulsive or habitual. So again, anything like the obsessional thinking in anxiety disorders, or like the like the compulsive behavior that comes up in addictions, these are problems that that mindfulness can help, including things like attention deficit disorder, impulse control disorder, and so on. When we look at compassion practices, they're especially helpful for the psychological core of depression, right, which is self-attack or self-loathing, and also naturally for relationship problems that come from early childhood trauma and attachment disorders. So compassion training really helps with that, and it also helps with social problems like racial and gender and class bias, and the way that they impact our relationships or even our social policies. So compassion training is extremely important for those kinds of emotional patterns. And then when we're dealing with the oldest part of the brain, we're dealing with early traumas or overwhelming traumas that are not processed cognitively or narratively, but are kind of split off into a physical experience of autonomic reactivity and extreme worst case memories and assumptions. And these kinds of practices are best dealt with, in my view, by the embodied practices. That is imagery, affirmation, breath work, and movement, because these sort of short circuit the conscious mind and speak directly to these older pre-verbal parts of our mind where the suffering happened. So that's a kind of general overview of how these practices relate to specific disease entities. I'd also say there's a more general model that I developed in CBRT to look at how the different kinds of meditation practices impact stress and trauma. So in general, you can think of contemplative psychotherapy as having a kind of unified diagnostic system or a unified understanding of pathology. That is simply that most human suffering is a result of wear and tear on the mind and body that's caused by stress and trauma. And that emphasizes the stress reactive or stress related or trauma related part of all mental afflictions. And there's quite a bit of neuroscience evidence to support this generalizing and sort of depathologizing of things like trauma or anxiety disorders or attachment disorders. And in that context, I believe that that mindfulness helps especially to overcome the cognitive part of stress, which is negative appraisal. Compassion helps to overcome the emotional part of stress, which is the distress emotions of anger and fear and shame. And embodied practices help overcome visceral stress. That is, they help to manage the autonomic nervous system and retrain it to be less stress reactive and more healing and socially engaged. So that's a mouthful. I apologize, but just a general response.
Okay, we have another question. What's the degree of success of these techniques of meditation to reduce stress and blood pressure?
Well, there's very good data going back all the way to the 70s to show that meditation practices help powerfully impact stress-related illnesses like high blood pressure. Again, PTSD is another example of this, but physical conditions like high blood pressure and so on. And that, I would say that almost all of these practices can help with high blood pressure, but especially the calming, the mindfulness-based approaches, and they're also very good working with chronic pain. There's also a way in which stress is involved in so many of our health conditions, right? So researchers who study the impact of stress on the immune system and the metabolism have shown that stress through increasing the amount of cytokines, what we call inflammatory cytokines in our body, it impairs our immunity, leaves us more prone to heart disease, to obesity, diabetes, even cancer, as well as dementia. So stress, we're discovering, seems to be involved in pretty much all illnesses, both mental and physical. And there is very good evidence to show that, or very promising evidence to show that practicing meditation can help improve our physical health and our immunity, as well as our mental health and well-being.
There's another question. By mindfulness, do you mean shamatha and vipassana? How about compassion, karuna, and metta? Thank you for your detailed answers.
Okay, so mindfulness, sati or smriti, or sati is the Pali word, smriti is the Sanskrit word. Mindfulness is a basic training for meditation. Within the Buddhist tradition, it's the first, tends to be the first kind of meditation people are taught. And what it does is it starts to help to train our attention so that we can begin to concentrate at will and focus. So it turns out that mindfulness practice is the same as the first 3 or 4 steps of shamatha practice. Shamatha, in other words, this word shamatha is a Sanskrit word that means calming the mind, or stabilizing the mind. And essentially, within the Buddhist tradition, that deeper calming, focusing, and stabilizing of the mind is just an extension of a training process that begins with mindfulness. First, we develop mindfulness and awareness. Then we start to develop greater concentration and greater flow. And so they're part of the same tradition, the same trajectory, training the mind to be focused and calm. Now, the other word you mentioned was vipassana. Again, in Pali, that word is vipassana. In Sanskrit, it's vipassana. And that means insight. And so traditionally, in both the Theravada, the Pali tradition, and in the Mahayana, the Sanskrit tradition, the purpose of meditation is not just to calm or focus the mind. If we just calm and focus the mind, but we don't learn and we don't change, we haven't really helped ourselves. I mean, in a big way. We've taken a vacation, we've taken a spa, a little break from our lives, but we haven't actually changed the factors of stress and reactivity and trauma that make us suffer, that are the factors driving the human condition. So insight meditation, that is the capacity to combine mindfulness or mental abiding, mental calm with awareness and insight, is the therapeutic delivery system or the platform for doing therapy in Buddhist psychology. It's combining calm mind and clear thinking, clear discernment, clear investigating. Now, that platform of a calm mind or a calm body mind and a sharp awareness or sharp examining also works for developing compassion, right? So we can calm the mind through shamatha or mindfulness, create a great sense of inner peace and stability. And when we're in that place of stability, we can develop insight into why we suffer or how we can be happier. We can choose to let go of old habits that are unhealthy or stress producing and develop new habits that are well-being promoting. And one of those new habits is compassion. So metta, which is a word for kindness or loving kindness in Pali, and karuna, maitri in Sanskrit, usually described as love and compassion. These are about warming the heart. And what's important, this is part of the ethical way of being, or the attitude or the spirit of healing in the Buddhist culture, is that it's not just about having a clear mind, it also is about having a warm, caring heart. And so when we have a calm mind and we can learn to let go of habits of suffering, worst case thinking, negative thinking, we can think more clearly, but we can also start to cultivate, to regulate our emotions more effectively and shift out of negative emotions that disturb us and can push us to unhealthy behavior, and shift into positive emotions like acceptance, tolerance, gratitude, love, compassion, that are like medicine and heal us. And this is where we shift into what in the West we call positive psychology, and understanding the power, the healing power of love and compassion is extremely important. So, that there's many different ways in which meditation skills come together in the healing process in contemplative psychotherapy or in Buddhist practice.
Okay, there's a few more questions. The first one is, I work within the field of behavior addictions. From your talk, I can see it's imperative to work with mindfulness, compassion, and embodied practices. Given that the social environment of the person has also been affected or compromised, and that there may be also trauma, what's your opinion on the MBRP program, on using this program for addictions? It's a program created by Bowen, Chola, and Marlatt.
Yeah, I mean, I think mindfulness is a very good foundation for working with addiction, because the essence of addiction, really is we are suffering in a very deep way, and it could be from trauma, it could be from childhood neglect or abuse, it could be from social stress, from prejudice or poverty or whatever. And when we suffer unbearably, we naturally try to develop coping mechanisms or habit patterns to soothe the suffering. So most addictions really come out of an attempt to escape or relieve suffering in a short period of time, like immediately. And the problem is most addictions actually do help us feel better immediately in the moment we practice them. It's just in the long run, they end up making us feel worse because they're not really healthy coping strategies. They're just what we think of as temporary distractions. So in Buddhist psychology, we think of addictions not as really pleasant or happy, but as a temporary diminution of suffering. And so the first thing we have to do in order to deal with the suffering and addiction is we have to stop the addictive behavior, which is a deeply ingrained self-caring or self-coping mechanism that's all wrong, that's self-destructive. And in order to stop that, we need to slow the whole, the whole life of stress and trauma, the whole freight train or engine of stress and trauma down, so a person can start to feel safe and supported living with their suffering on a moment-to-moment basis. Mindfulness is extremely important. And as you said, because it's not just the person's own mind and body that's suffering. It's usually an environment, a culture, a society. So it's important that we create a counterculture, an alternative community where people can feel safe and supported, not engaging in their compulsion and starting to learn that they can face their suffering, bear their suffering, and share their suffering. Sharing is extremely important because ultimately the most stress-relieving form of coping for humans is a positive connection with other humans. So if you think of the recovery movement or you think of mindfulness groups, what they do is they provide people and sharing as an alternative to addiction, right? It's the people and the sharing in a safe setting that allows people to start to let go of the addiction that they are familiar coping with. I would say that in the beginning, mindfulness is very important. I think as people progress, recovery isn't just about abstinence. It's also about transforming your way of being. In the 12-step recoveries model, for example, they say that addiction is a spiritual disease. And what they mean by that is it starts really at the very foundation of our relationship with ourselves and the world. And so once we have some abstinence, we need skills to get to the bottom of why we're suffering so much. And that's where I think compassion and embodied practices might come in terms of the more advanced levels of recovery or the higher stages of recovery.
Okay, there's a few more questions. Do you have any thoughts on death and rebirth?
Yes, well, I think that this is an area where Buddhist psychology, as I mentioned, it seems to be very incompatible with Western science and psychology. And so personally, I've struggled with this over the course of my life studying Buddhism and practicing Buddhism. And many people, many of my students and clients find it hard to understand, how they can accept the view of reincarnation. The important thing to realize from my point of view, and this is my own personal way of addressing this culture clash, is that the essence of the Buddhist mythology or psychology of reincarnation is not reincarnation. It's not about a person being born over multiple lives. It's about the actions we perform in the present moment having an impact on the future, right? So remember I said the first principle of Buddhist psychology and the first principle of modern psychology are that the mind is efficacious, that it is causally effective. The word karma literally means action in Sanskrit. It doesn't mean rebirth. There's another word for that. Karma means action. And why it means that karma is part of a particle, karma phala or karma vipaka, that is, karma means that our mental activities produce an effect as part of nature, that they're not just spinning like a third wheel or like just along for the ride. They are part of the mechanism that we evolved consciousness because it works. And it can either work for us or it can work against us. And when our mental activities are based on delusion or misunderstanding and destructive emotions like fear and anger, they work against us. They lock us even more into the cycle of stress and trauma. When they're based on wisdom and compassion, our actions work for us. We become healthier, wiser, happier, more connected. So the essence of karma is a view that the mind is part of nature. So in Western psychology, I'm sorry, this is complicated. I apologize. In Western psychology, we agree that the body is part of nature. We agree that our bodies evolved over infinite or many, many lifetimes, and that our genes encode and our brains encode all the trial and error that led to our human form of life and to our particular brains. But we don't really say that about the mind. Somehow we think the mind is just all floating along, or it's just determined by the body. The reality is our minds are also part of nature, but they're not reducible to our genes. So both Freud and Jung believed that some kind of intergenerational inheritance or psychological inheritance is essential if we want to explain how the mind works. And what I mean by that is our minds don't start when we're born. We're born into a stream of information. We're born with parents. We're born into a family system. We're born into a social system, into a culture. And when our consciousness emerges, it's instantly filled by all this information that's been learned through many generations. And so that's how I understand reincarnation. Is not that literally my personality floats off from my body and when I die and goes into another body, but that mind is an intergenerational medium for the inheritance of learned information. And that it is by nature intergenerational, multi-generational, and that if we don't understand that, we don't understand the real full nature of our suffering, how we're embedded in a history of suffering, in a familial history, a cultural history, and that we need to learn about this history of suffering in order to really relieve it. So I hope that helps. That's my particular kind of way out of this conundrum, but it may not be yours.
There's a group of questions that I'm putting together because they refer to the same theme. And some people are asking if they're not psychologists, but they are in assistance professions. They're like coaches, or they have been training in programs like Cultivating Emotional Balance or other types of programs. These studies, would they accredit them to provide therapeutic assistance to other people? Could they, for example, do one-on-one counseling? Would they be qualified because they would like to deepen their skills and they would like to be able to better help people, but they're not sure if this program, how would it help them do that?
Okay, that's a great question. And there's two sides to it. So on the one hand, even though we call this a contemplative psychotherapy program, and many of the participants tend to be therapists or social workers or physicians or health providers, we actually are interdisciplinary in our approach. So we typically, our groups have members who are other kinds of caregivers, teachers, coaches, ministers, health coaches, and consultants of different kinds. So you're welcome to join the program, even if you even if you're not a therapist or you have no, health practice or credentialing or whatever. On the other hand, this is not a degree program and it's not a licensing program. This will not give you any license and it will not give you any degree. As Javier mentioned, I took Nalanda Institute out of the university. I had developed it in Columbia University, but I did not feel I was free in that context to teach what I really needed to teach, what people really needed to learn, which is this very different way of approaching life and suffering. So as a result, we are a freestanding, not-for-profit institute. We are an educational institute, but we don't give degrees and we don't give licenses. So if you want to learn how to use skills that will help you and your clients, you can learn them with us. But if you want a license to call yourself a therapist or something else, this is not the program for you. Some other licensing program is necessary, unfortunately.
Another question is if you could clarify the difference between Buddhist psychology as a framework for contemplative psychotherapy and the Buddhist approach as a religious or spiritual path.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, and I was meaning to address this. So most of us who have studied Buddhism in the West know Buddhism as a religion, as a spiritual tradition, and we believe that our experience of it is that it is really about our liberation, potentially our enlightenment, depending on how ambitious we are. And then it's a very high spiritual calling, and it's not really worldly, and it's not about something as mundane as health or well-being. And there's even some critiques of the application of mindfulness and other related practices to health and well-being, suggesting that somehow that's diminishing the real value of the practices. I really don't believe that. And I've, in addition to training in Buddhist psychology and getting a lot of teaching from very high teachers like His Holiness the Dalai Lama or some of his tutors, I've also trained with Tibetan doctors, several of them, including Dr. Yeshe Dundin, more recently with Dr. Nida. And the fact of the matter is that the Buddha's basic philosophy and his basic framework of spiritual practice is a healing practice, right? The basic understanding of the Noble Truths is that we will have healing as well as freedom. And the Buddha is often compared to a doctor, and the Buddhist practice is compared to medicine. And this is not an accident. This is very intentional. The Buddha didn't want to separate spirituality from worldly health and well-being, from immediate physical health and well-being. And the Buddhist medical tradition explains that. The Buddhist medical tradition opened the first medical schools and hospitals pretty much throughout Asia. And the reason why Buddhism went into Tibet was because of a Buddhist doctor who healed the queen. So we believe in the healing application of the contemplative science and practice that comes out of this spiritual tradition. Yes, the highest application of that is ultimate supreme freedom and enlightenment, but that is not the only acceptable way of using these practices. And in fact, if you listen to Tibetan doctors always give meditations and ethical lifestyle changes to their patients And they often teach the most profound meditations, secret, esoteric meditations. And the reason is because they believe that spiritual realization is not separate from healing, that we are suffering, that's our fundamental predicament in samsara, is that we have an illness, and that these approaches are mental, spiritual, and physical healing approaches. And so we very much believe at Nalanda Institute that these practices are essential to every human being living. We don't all have to be enlightened. It would be wonderful if we all were liberated and enlightened tomorrow. But in the meanwhile, we have to become less troubled, less frightened, less traumatized, less angry, less alienated, and more caring and more connected. Otherwise, the suffering will continue. So that's our response to that really very important question.
There's one more question. We are discussing positive aspects of contemplative practices, but are there also some studies on the opposite, on negative responses to mindfulness, for example, as aggravating trauma?
Yeah, there's no foolproof, all interventions or practices are human creations. So, part of the transparency of the Buddhist tradition is that the Buddha was honest enough to say that he didn't have a revelation. He was just trying to help reduce his own suffering and find freedom and to help others. But as a result of that, since all Buddhist practice and all Buddhist concepts, just like Western practice and Western concepts or any other cultural human practices, are just human constructions. So they, just like anything else, they could be helpful, or if they're misused, they could be harmful. And so we do have to know, part of our purpose in the 2-year program in contemplative psychotherapy is to help people not just get a few tools, but to really understand more deeply the context for using the tools and for engaging with others in a way that protects themselves and others from harm, and optimizes the potential for healing. So vis-a-vis, mindfulness, for example, yes, mindfulness, if someone's traumatized and they start paying attention to their minds, it could be triggering, by all means. If someone is severely self-attacking and tries to be loving and kind toward other people and becomes even more self-attacking, that's a possible problem with compassion practice. If someone uses intensive breathing without the right support or understanding, it can create autonomic imbalances. So all of these practices can be misused, but those misuses are very elaborately described in the tradition. I mean, it's not like we're the first people to discover this. And again, if we study what the proper use is and what the potential problems are, then we'll be sensitive to them. And if someone is having some kind of, negative reaction to a method, we'll just stop and we'll ask them to stop and we'll try something else. And unfortunately, there's a great range of different practices. So for example, with trauma, intensive breath work has been found to be extremely helpful. And so has visualization practice found to be extremely helpful. So usually within the whole tool chest, if you will, there are practices that can be somewhat helpful, even if other practices don't seem to be working. I'm not hearing you, Mar.
Sorry, I was muted. There's a few questions regarding whether we're going to offer this program in Portuguese.
Okay, so what we've decided, and Javier, I don't know if you want to speak to this, but what we've decided in discussing this, the interest in Latin America, including Brazil, in our contemplative psychotherapy program, is to try to expand the Spanish language program so that it supports Portuguese-speaking students by offering translations of the lectures in Portuguese, not necessarily simultaneous like today, but written translations, and also some Portuguese-speaking teachers who can help students understand the nuances in their own language, as well as some Portuguese readings. So we're trying to adapt the program to make it friendly to Portuguese-speaking students as well as Spanish-speaking students. If you're interested, by all means, you're welcome to give it a try.
Okay, I have a question about whether it's common that after an initial period of practice by a patient, he or she continues to practice, and then what helps patients continue to practice this special medicine?
So patients, like providers, like caregivers, we're human. And so we all really have limits in terms of how far we can go with any technique or any single learning. And this is the reason why, remember I mentioned that within the Buddhist learning tradition, healing occurs not just because the individual practices, but because the individual is part of a community and subscribes to or relies on a tradition and mentors. So typically when people reach the limit of what they can do on their own, that's the time to go back and either get more support from a community that's a healing community of practice, or from teachers, or to learn more and study more. And I think this is true for all of us, myself included, and I'm sure Javier can say yes to this, and Mara and all of us, that we need to keep learning, and we need others to help us keep learning. This isn't like a pill you can just take every day and you're fine. This is a lifelong learning process, and that means connecting with others and getting help when we're stuck.
Okay, I have two more questions. One is, it starts with a short reflection. We deal with different kinds and levels of destructive emotions. The antidote seems to be training the mind. We have these destructive emotions because of work stress, the pandemic, etc. How will the year of mindfulness address this issue?
Well, the mindfulness year teaches the foundations of Buddhist psychology and practice. So what that means is gaining the strength of mind, that is through meditative training, to really be able to slow our reactivity down, and gradually using Buddhist psychology, which involves wisdom and ethics, to help understand what's driving our destructive emotions. Right? So one thing that drives our destructive emotions is just habit, life in survival mode, what I call an evolutionary hangover, right? Or it could be a traumatic childhood or traumatic past. Work stress, as you say, is usually the external stress is just the tip of the iceberg. So basic Buddhist psychology is the, I think, in my view, the most important, powerful, and effective foundation for understanding how we harm ourselves, how our own minds can, and bodies and nervous systems can keep us locked in suffering. And I call this living in survival mode. And the wonderful thing about Buddhist psychology is that it teaches in great detail how we stay stuck in survival mode. And it also teaches how to get out of it, how to shift gears, how to become more familiar with and more involved in what I call thriving mode. That is the path toward nirvana, or freedom, happiness, liberation that lasts, not the temporary kind. So I think that the mindfulness year is the best year if you want to work with destructive emotions. We also touch on one thing that's extremely important in working with destructive emotions, which is self-compassion. Which is the other missing ingredient or important ingredient, is learning to accept the way we are and to bring real care to trying to reparent ourselves, if you will. So, a great question, and yeah, we will certainly be working with how to deal with destructive emotions in the mindfulness year.
Okay, there's a final question. What's the Buddhist view on life accelerating so much, our need to contribute even more to society? And this is a question related to the age of Aquarius.
Yeah, well, let me just respond very briefly to another theme that the last question raised about COVID. And of course, I would just say this is an extremely important time because we're all so isolated from each other and we're all living in constant angst about our health or our neighbor's health or our family member's health. So it's a time when it's a very good time to take a retreat and practice how to heal ourselves and become more resilient and more present and caring. You know, yeah, we're at a historic turning point. And to some extent, the pandemic may be part of that, right? Because it shows how deeply interconnected we all are. It shows how unequal and repressive our societies can be. And it really helps us all realize that each of us has to be part of the solution, right? That there's something each of us can do to try to live a more healthy, wholesome, grounded, mindful life. You know, the way we live, you know, the pace at which we live and the aggression with which we live, the violence with which we live is not, we're not made for it. And it doesn't seem to be consistent with peace of mind or well-being. On the other hand, the fact that we're all connected and we all have such incredible access to information and practices is a silver lining or a blessing of the complicated modern way of life. So can we take advantage of that? Can we learn how to get connected, get access to teachings like this, to accelerate our own personal development so that we can shift the curve of our civilization toward real sustainable happiness and well-being and sustainable living. We all need to do this. We can't wait for our leaders to do it. Obviously, a lot of them are just crazy, let alone they're only just one person or one group of people. Humans, we all have a part to play in helping to, you know, save humanity and our planet, and learning how to disarm and live in peace and compassion and healthy creativity. This is what these ancient traditions are all about. And this is why it's so important that they've come to be part of the modern world of healing, psychotherapy, well-being, positive living, because we really need them now. This coming together of modern science with ancient wisdom is a great potential blessing for humanity. If we can all really make it work, take advantage of this very special time.
Okay, there's one last question. I would like to know how effective is mindfulness for bipolar and schizophrenia? Then it gets a little technical and I'm not really sure. It's a question by Silvana. If we're not addressing it, maybe she can ask her directly, but yeah, that's mainly how effective and how possible it is to apply it.
Yeah, well, there's some pretty good research using mindfulness and loving kindness with schizophrenic populations that shows that they really benefit. They become less psychotic, more connected. They need less medication. And I would say there's less research in the realm of bipolar, but I would, I would say the same is likely true. Why? Because if we understand the general model that I presented earlier, that human mental suffering is, at least in large part, a function of the wear and tear of stress and trauma, right? The genetic component, even to bipolar disorder and to schizophrenia, is modest. It's somewhere between 20 to 40%. So what's the rest? That means that the rest of the etiology of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder is developmental or social, stress related, and hence it can be improved. And I would say if you add to that what we're learning about the impact of meditation on epigenetics, the way in which meditative practices change how our cells read our genes and can change our chemistry, I would say the prognosis is, good. If someone is motivated, that these practices can help in bipolar and schizophrenia. And, I think they will be tried and they will be increasingly used. I mean, it doesn't mean that we won't also use medication or other techniques, but it does sort of create a new realm of possible, possible solutions.
Okay, so that's it with questions. We don't have any more questions. We've allowed all participants to unmute themselves if they wish to say goodbye at the end of the talk.
Okay, great.
Everyone's saying thank you in the chat.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much.
Javier, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Javier.
Gracias.
Gracias, gracias.
Obrigada.
Thank you.
Obrigada, gracias.
Obrigado.
Thank you. Thank you.
Obrigado.
Thank you so
much.
Obrigada.
Obrigada.
Gracias.
Obrigada.
Obrigada, abraço, gente.
Gracias.
Gracias, Joey.
Gracias.
Gracias, Javier. Saludos a
Be
todos.
well, everyone.
Adiós a todos.
Adiós.
Adiós.
Rafael,
Adiós.
Laura.
Ciao. Thank you.
Chao.
Ciao.
Tchau.
Thank you.
Obrigado.
Gratidão. Muito obrigada.
Obrigado.
Muito obrigada.
Okay. And thank you especially to Mar and Javier. Ciao, Anna.
Ciao.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Thank you to Mar and Javier, and to our two wonderful translators, Fausto and Doris. Gracias a todos. Obrigado.
Igualmente yo. See you next time.
See you next time.
Gracias, Joe.
Ciao, gracias.
Gracias, Joe.
Ciao.
It's another Javier. Okay. All right, Mark?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that was wonderful, right?
Yeah, and the translators, thanks so much. Sorry for there were a couple technical glitches with the muting and unmuting.
Yes.
But we got it.
Oh, Tamara, take care. Christina, Javier, ciao.
Oh.
Ciao.
Okay. And,
Thank
okay.
you.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Take care.